Normally, when you think about the state of Georgia and presidents of the United States, the first person who pops into mind is Jimmy Carter. But another president that was associated with the state of Georgia that you may not know of is the 32nd president of the United States of America, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. Today we've traveled up into Pine Mountain, Georgia, and we're at the home of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1924, Franklin D. Roosevelt, in hopes of getting aid for his polio, decided to come to Warm Springs, Georgia. He loved the area because of its warm springs, which were said to help if you had polio. So he built a small white cottage in 1932, and while he was the president, he made frequent trips down here to Warm Springs, Georgia to get treatment for his polio. So the house that he had built here became known as the Little Whitehouse. Today, in present time, the house has been preserved in its original 1945 state. And it is also said that many of his solutions to the people problems he solved as a result of his association with people who live here in Warm Springs, Georgia. We're going to check out that Little White House today, which is still in its original state, still like it was in 1945, the last time FDR was here. The Franklin D. Roosevelt Warm Springs Memorial Commission. There's the man himself, FDR. FDR's custom-built 1940s Willie Roadster. Here's a model of the USS Potomac, which was known as Roosevelt's floating White House. You can see here on the timeline, in 1922, he was diagnosed with polio. Here's a picture of him. FDR finds relief swimming in the warm springs. This is President Franklin D. Roosevelt's wheelchair. It was used by him, and he actually sat in this chair, and the same as these braces here. Very cool. It's awesome that they have those. 1938. FDR appeals to Hitler and Mussolini to settle European problems amicably. Here's a record of other presidents who have visited this museum. John F. Kennedy, the other Georgia president, Jimmy Carter, and President Bill Clinton. And this is FDR's 1938 Ford. FDR was here in Warm Springs when he announced that he was going to run for president of the United States. This was the saddle used by him when he would come out here and ride horses. This was given to FDR by the NRA as a gift. Of course, FDR had the tough task of bringing the country together during World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor happened while FDR was in office. A naval cape used by FDR. We're going to head into an auditorium now where they are going to be showing a movie. And wow, that got really bright when I got out here in the sun.
In his first 100 days in office, he herded dozens of new programs and policies through Congress. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in as president on March 4, 1933, no one could have predicted the legacy of economic and social programs he would leave this country. In 1924, when Franklin Roosevelt came to Warm Springs, Georgia, he was seeking a cure for the polio that had attacked him 3 years earlier. Roosevelt brought money and attention to this little community in middle Georgia. Here they could find relief in the 88-degree water that flowed year-round into specially designed pools. For those whose arms and legs were weakened or paralyzed by polio, movement was easier in the warm, buoyant water.
I saw President Roosevelt at the pool several times. He got in there and played volleyball and basketball with the kids and just carried on like he never knew he was the President of the United States.
Roosevelt loved Warm Springs, and for 21 years, until his death in 1945, he came here as often as possible to relax and exercise in the soothing spring waters.
Now we are going to go back onto the property to see where he lived and worked and relaxed and had fun. Down here was FDR's home. This was the Little Whitehouse. But because he was president of the United States and obviously he had to be secure, on both sides of the entrance they had sentry posts. This was a Secret Service sentry post, and across the way they would have a Marine stationed. And in here in the middle, they had what was called the bump gate. This gate would swing to close it off or to open to allow entrance into the property. FDR was confined to a wheelchair, but he drove using a car that had special hand controls that he made so that he could still drive using his hands. Well, he couldn't get out to open the gate because obviously he's in a wheelchair. So the gate was designed, he could come up to it, bump it, it would open up, he could drive through, and it would close behind him. Amazing. If the Secret Service and the Marines allowed you entrance, then you could make your way down into the Little Whitehouse. Here right out front of the property, this is the 48 Star flag. The flag flown here on April the 12th of 1945, which was the day that Franklin Roosevelt died. This was the type of flag that was flying. This isn't the actual flag up there now, but it was the type of flag that was flying the day he passed. And again, down here with the Little Whitehouse over here, out here at the front of the property, there's these other two buildings here. This was the servants' quarters, and this was his guest house. Now, this was the servants' quarters. Look at their bathroom with they could sit on the toilet and look out the window, or somebody could look up in the window into somebody sitting on the toilet. Isn't that fabulous? Servants were on duty 24 hours a day while the president was here. This room right here belonged to the president's personal chef, Miss Daisy Bonner, and Irvin McDuffie, who was the president's personal valet and chauffeur, and his wife. They occupied this room here on the right across the way from it here. Now this is the guest house. If FDR was entertaining guests, this is where they would stay. Here's a view of the servants' quarters here on the left and the guest house here on the right. Now this would be FDR's view as he walked out of his home. This would be his view. His home, the door to the Little Whitehouse is right here behind me. He would walk out and this is what he would see in his front yard. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, died in this house on April 12th of 1945. So I was waiting until I got to the area, but obviously that plaque there notates that FDR was here in Warm Springs the day he died. He was actually having a painting made of him when he had a stroke and died on the spot. The painting was unfinished, and that painting is still here on the property as well. FDR's living room area, and this is his dining room. This is where FDR ate. The old record player there. That's amazing. Now we're gonna go out this door. Onto the president's personal balcony here. And of course, looking right off the back, there's another Marine Corps sentry post there. President Roosevelt could roll his wheelchair right out here and look at all these trees. And over here on this side, off the back porch, this led you to the president's bedroom. When he stayed here in Warm Springs, President FDR slept on this bed. And in fact, on April 12th of 1945, the president was carried to this room by his staff after he collapsed having his portrait made. At 3:35 p.m., after a bunch of medical efforts, the nation's 32nd president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was pronounced dead. On April 13th, 1945, the president's body was taken to Washington, D.C. for a state funeral, and from there he was taken to his family home in Hyde Park, New York, where he was buried in the Rose Garden. He was brought right here from having his portrait made, laid in this bed. The doctors worked on him, tried to save his life after he had a massive stroke. They couldn't, and he passed away and died laying right here. A closet with all of his towels, bath mats, and sheets. You can tell they've all discolored over all these years, but they're all monogrammed. You see FDR. This is what the back porch would have looked like when the president was here. You can see these scratches here in the glass. These scratches were put there by FDR's pet dog, a Scotty, who looked just like that. And those panes are still there, those window panes. And that, my friends, was Franklin D. Roosevelt's home. There's one last place to enter here on FDR's property, and it is the Legacy Center. He passed away on April the 12th of 1945. Now, I told you about the 48-star flag that flew over the White House. This was the 48-star flag that was flying over the Little Whitehouse on April the 12th, 1945, the day he passed away. This was that 48-star flag right here. Good painting of him there. President Roosevelt is dead. Truman sworn in as his successor. Here's a telegram. This is amazing. Look at this. This was to the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. I have the sad duty of announcing to the Naval Service the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, comma, the President of the United States, comma, which occurred on the 12th of April. X, the world has lost a champion of democracy. That is amazing. Oh my gosh. From the Secretary of the Navy. This here is the actual wheelchair he was sitting in when he died. This is the actual one. He was sitting in that chair, having that portrait painted. When he had a massive stroke, staff carried him to his bed, tried to save his life. They did finish the painting, not on this original material. This painting stopped and was left exactly how it is at that exact moment. She came back and redid the painting, copying what she had done here and finishing it. And that painting is the one I just showed you a second ago. That is all for the Little Whitehouse, the home of FDR. But that's not all of our adventure. We are going to leave here now and head over to the Warm Springs, the place where FDR went swimming, which he thought was going to help cure him of the polio disease. So the reason why FDR would come to Warm Springs was because here in Warm Springs, Georgia, there's a warm spring that delivers 914 gallons of water into a basin, into a pool area that is a constant 88 degrees at all times. Franklin D. Roosevelt first came here in 1924 in hopes that he would recover from the effects of polio. He came to believe that the therapeutic benefits of the springs would help him recover from polio. After the polio epidemic was over, they transformed this Warm Springs into a hydrotherapeutic treatment center. They built a public pool. Eventually, it was closed in the 1960s. Here's a diorama of the Warm Springs pools. This is how it would have looked in 1928 when it was built. Now we're going to walk out into the therapeutic pool area. These pools would have been filled up by the warm spring water. This pool here would have been glass enclosed during its heyday. This is where all the pictures of the president were taken. There are tons of home movies out there of FDR and children with polio playing in this pool here together. Now this ramp was put in place so that all patients had access into the pool area. They would be able to roll a wheelchair or whatever kind of equipment they needed down in here. They were able to provide therapy in the pools because they stationed medical equipment in the pool, like the table you see here behind me. And there's even a chair over here. They would put these out all down inside of the pool, and the patients could come sit in them or lay on them and just have fun in the 88-degree warm spring water. Now, the spring doesn't pump out nowhere near the amount of water that it used to, but the spring has not dried up. And the remainder of what water does come from the pool is right here. The spring still pumps the water out into this. It is warm. Wow. But they've added a drain now so that the water drains down from the spring instead of filling the pool. Over here they had an area to come sit down, and it was covered so they could get out of the sun. And right here, this device was used to dry their towels. They could run their towel right through here, and then they could come turn this lever, and it would squeeze the water out of their towels and dry it for them. And I'm not sure, this looks like showers maybe. I guess this was just areas, not necessarily showers, but areas for patients to come change clothes, dressing rooms, and that type of thing. The people that came here for other therapeutic reasons besides polio were scared. They did not want to get polio because it was such a debilitating disease. So they were afraid to get near the polio patients or interact with the polio patients. That is it for Warm Springs, Georgia. The Warm Springs pools, the Little Whitehouse, where Franklin D. Roosevelt lived, the 32nd President of the United States. Man, this place was awesome to see. I've never been here before. This was my very first time, and it was amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed this visit. I think that we're gonna find us a place to stay here in town because there are some other things here around this area that we wanna see tomorrow. So I'm gonna end this video now. I do wanna say that there's 1 week left on the contest to win these spy glasses. Saturday of next week, that contest will be over, and the voting for the Bottom of YouTube Awards has now ended. So if you haven't voted, you won't get to vote. So thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode about Franklin D. Roosevelt in Warm Springs, Georgia. I'll see you again tomorrow. I hope you have a great day.